Good evening. I am Zaphodd the Nothingth. Tonight, I am reading a chapter from The City of Dreaming books by Walter Mowers, entitled The Sea and the Lighthouses. I awoke, unrefreshed. Not only hungry and thirsty, but in unwelcome company. Crawling and scrabbling around on my face and stomach were dozens of insects and other noisome creatures. Transparent maggots, worms, snakes, phosphorescent beetles, long-legged bookhoppers, earwigs armed with outsized pincers, eyeless white spiders. I leapt to my feet with a horrified scream and lashed out wildly. The creatures flew in all directions as I performed a grotesque dance, flailing away at my cloak in a panic. A gigantic bookworm emitted one last vicious hiss and rattled its scales at me before disappearing behind a heap of books. It wasn't until I was certain of having put the last of the vermin to flight that I recovered some of my composure. Then I set off again. What else could I do? By now, all my confidence had left me. There was no reason to believe that I was any nearer an exit. I might even have gone deeper still, and those insects had shown how quickly one could become part of the underworld's merciless food chain. Nor was the recurrent sight of half-dead jellyfish calculated to raise my spirits. Their futile attempts to escape were all too reminiscent of my own predicament. Like them, I would soon be lying dead on some tunnel floor, a desiccated, emaciated cadaver eaten away by vermin, and all because of a manuscript. The thought of it made me call a brief halt and take it out again. Could I decipher the underlying message that had landed me in this ticklish situation and might possibly help to extricate me from it? It was a foolish, desperate idea, but the only one I could come up with at that moment. So I proceeded to study the manuscript once more. I perused it with the same enthusiasm, the same reactions I'd displayed at first reading, and it afforded me temporary relief. Then I came to the last sentence. This is where my story begins. It sounded so hopeful, so boundlessly optimistic, that tears of joy welled up in my eyes. No story could have got off to a more confident start. I pocketed the manuscript and set off once more, pondering on the words that had reactivated my brain. I was suddenly overcome by a feeling that the mysterious author had meant to tell me something, that wherever he may be at this moment, he was speaking to me. This is where my story begins. But what was he implying? That my own story was only just beginning? That would be a very consoling thought. Or ought I to take the sentence even more literally? Don't ask me why I believed this, my faithful readers, but I felt sure the sentence was a riddle whose solution would help me regain my freedom. Very well. I would take it literally. This is where my story begins. Where was this? Here in the catacombs? Here where I happen to be at this moment? Agreed. But whose story did the author mean, if not mine? What else was here apart from myself? Insects, of course. And needless to say, books. That flash of inspiration almost killed me, it hit me so hard. Books, you idiot. It was thoroughly idiotic of me to ignore the books. If I could expect help from any quarter, it was from them. Although surrounded by thousands of wise potential advisors, I had been deterred from enlisting their aid by one unpleasant experience and a handful of legends about the hazardous books. I was involuntarily reminded of the way in which Colophonius Regenschein had found his bearings by means of the books around him. It was mainly in the order in which the various libraries and collections in the catacombs were arranged that had led him to his discoveries. That being so, wouldn't it be logical if the books could also guide a person back to the surface? Although not blessed with Regenschein's great expertise, I did have some knowledge of Zamonian literature, and it required no stroke of genius to determine a book's age from its condition, author, contents, and imprint. It was really quite simple. The older the books around me, the deeper in the catacombs I must be. The more recent they became, the closer I would be to an exit. Not invariably, of course, but often enough. Why? Because most libraries reflected the time in which their owners lived. Equipped with this simple compass, I would be able to get my bearings and find my way back to the surface and freedom, if I could summon up the courage to examine the books. What did I have to lose? If a hazardous book ripped off my head or drilled me between the eyes with a poisoned arrow, I would at least meet a quick and merciful end instead of dying a slow, agonizing death from starvation or being eaten alive by insects. Better to die on my feet than crawling along like a jellyfish. All I had to do now was to overcome my fear and open a book. I came to a halt, went over to a shelf, took out a book at random, weighed it in my hand. Was it unusually heavy? Could I hear something rattle inside it? No. Or was it too light because it contained a cavity filled with lethal gas? No, it wasn't too light either. I shut my eyes and averted my head, and opened it. Nothing happened. No explosion, no poisoned arrow, no cloud of splintered glass. Gingerly, I touched the pages. No cold sensation in my fingers. Could I detect any signs of incipient madness? Hard to say. I glunked my teeth. No, they didn't fall out either. Everything seemed firm enough. Vertigo? Nausea? Fever? Nothing of the kind. I opened my eyes again. Phew. It was a perfectly normal, harmless book. No explosive device, no cylinder of lethal gas, or hypo filled with acid. It was just a book, like most other books. Paper covered with print and bound in hog skin. Pah! What else had I been expecting? Paranoid simpleton that I was. The odds against encountering a toxicotome out of all the works down here were probably 10,000 to 1. I looked at the title. Hey, I actually knew this book, though only superficially. It was Nothing of Importance by Nemo de Zilch, the founder of Grailsundian equalitism, a school of philosophy dedicated to total indifference. It is wholly immaterial whether or not you read this book. Zilch's opening sentence had always deterred me from reading on, just as it did this time. I replaced the book on the shelf, unread. A reaction that would have delighted the equalitists, because it precisely complied with the aim of their sect, which was to be utterly ineffectual. Nevertheless, the book had supplied me with some important information. It could only have hailed from the Zamonian early Middle Ages, because the equalitists were active at that period, and it was a first impression of the first edition. I walked on, past innumerable bookcases, without bestowing any attention on their contents, leaving passage after passage behind me. Then I paused, took out a book at random, and opened it. Life, alas, is all too short, Prince Summerbird remarked, heaving a big sigh. Well, his friend Novello Fluff rejoined with a smile as he poured himself a glass of wine, if by that you mean to espouse the view that our span of existence is depressingly limited, I won't take issue with you. Madame Fonseca looked amused. Ah, she interposed. I see you gentlemen are once more discussing the regrettable fact that our sojourn on earth is subject to shocking constraints from the temporal aspect. No doubt about it. This was a plethoric novel, one of Zamonian literature's more grotesque aberrations, in which variations on a single basic theme were repeated ad nauseum. And when had the plethorists been active? In the late Middle Ages. I was heading in the right direction, therefore having progressed from the early to the late Middle Ages. Quick, go on! Again I passed countless shelves and bookcases without heeding their contents. I saw 2 variegated jellyfish clinging to each other in their death throes, but the sight no longer dismayed me. I was filled with hope once more. Then I paused. Water cuts no bread were the first words I read on opening a book of verse. What was that called? Of course, it was an addination, a natural impossibility. And what school of poetry had traditionally begun its poems with natural impossibilities? The addinationists, of course. And when was the heyday of the addinationists? Before or after that of the plethorists? After. I had left the Middle Ages behind and come to Zamonian High Baroque. From now on, I checked at ever shorter intervals, allowing myself more time, examined several books in many bookcases, and deployed all the literary knowledge Dancelot Wordwright had instilled in me. Had Horatio Seneca been writing before or after Pistolarius Grenk? When had Platoto de Medici introduced adaptionism into Zamonian literature? Had Glorian Cucurbit belonged to the Grailsundian Pastelists or the Tralamander Circle? Did Freda the Hirsute's oxymoronic verses hail from her blue or yellow period? I thanked my authorial godfather in retrospect for the relentless way in which he had drummed all these facts into my head. How I had cursed him for it! Yet now they might possibly save my life. I felt I was sailing across a dark sea in which countless lighthouses stood on little islands. The lighthouses were writers, beaming their lonely messages across the centuries. I was sailing from island to island, guided by those literary beacons. They were the thread that would lead me out of the labyrinth. Hunger and thirst forgotten, I snatched book after book off the shelves, deduced my progress from them, and hurried on, then paused once more and took out another. The universe imploded were its opening words. Definitely an anticlimacticist novel, a genre whose exponents began their books at the most exciting and spectacular juncture. Thereafter, they allowed the storyline to relapse, becoming steadily duller and more inconsequential until it petered out halfway through a casual remark. The anticlimacticists were assigned to the Zamonian Romantic era, so I had come a stage further. He disquelched his lips from hers and creakled down in a decrepit old armchair, holding up the crustling sheet of paper. He examined it peeringly. "Is this really his will?" he surprised. She groan-sighed. "You mean he hasn't left us Dunkelstein Manor after all? Just an old milking stool?" He curse-hurled the document into the fireplace, where it cruspitated to ashes. With a scorn laugh, he gobbucked on the floor. She sob-wept snufflingly. Good heavens! Onomatopoeic dynaprose. The authors of the period had presumably lost faith in their readers' powers of imagination and felt they had to beef up their writing with gimmicky neologisms of this kind, which ruined its dramatic impact by modern standards. People like Rowley Fantono and Montaigne's Trumper had written such stuff in the belief that it was terribly modern, whereas all a modern eye could discern in such fatuities was their authors were terribly old hat. After that, these were the beginnings of the Zamonian Nouveau Roman, the first experimental essays in a new form of literature. I was heading briskly for the modern era. Count Elphinsenf, may I introduce Professor Phlogisto Lafitte, the inventor of anoxygenic air? Perhaps the three of us could play a hand of Rumo together. Ah, yes, I had definitely reached modern times. That little snatch of dialogue was proof enough for me. It came from a Count Elphinsef novel, the precursor of all Zamonian detective stories, of which Manolo Hack had written dozens just 2 centuries ago. Although hardly great literature, his books were almost as popular as the Prince Sangfroid novels, especially with younger readers. This one was Count Elphinsenf and the Breathless Professor, which I had read probably half a dozen times in my boyhood. The same shelf held all the other novels in the series, from Count Elphinsenf and the Iron Potato to Count Elphinsenf and the Piratical Zombie. I wouldn't have minded reading them all again, but this wasn't an appropriate time. Instead, I took a book from the shelf beside them. It was small, untitled, and bound in black leather. Opening it, I read The Way of the Book Hunter by Rongkong Koma. Bingo! This was a really recent publication. Rongkong Koma. Wasn't he the one who had hunted Regenshine so relentlessly? A contemporary, no less. I dipped into the book as I walked on. Rule number 1. The book hunter is as lonely in the labyrinth as a sphinx. His home is darkness. His hope is death. Somber stuff. Still, it was by a book hunter, and they couldn't all be as brilliant as Colophonius Regenshine. Rule number 2. All book hunters are equal. Equally worthless. A really likable individual, this Rongkong Koma. Not exactly the type of person one wanted to bump into down here in the dark. Rule number 3. Anything alive can be killed. Anything dead can be eaten. This, it seemed, was the intellectually limited philosophy of a professional murderer. Hardly my favorite kind of reading, but a contemporary work that was what mattered. I tossed it over my shoulder and pulled out another volume, a particularly striking specimen bound in glittering steel and sumptuously adorned with silver, gold, and copper fittings. Imagine my astonishment, dear readers, when I opened it to reveal a complicated mechanism in place of printed pages. At the time, I felt relieved because had it been a hazardous book, I would have been standing there, headless, or transfixed by an arrow between the eyes. But what was it? I saw cogwheels revolving, springs tensing, miniature pistons sliding back and forth, and then, at the top of the book's interior, which resembled a peep show or puppet theater, a copper curtain rose, and some little metal figures appeared on the tiny stage. Although as two-dimensional as the puppets in a shadow theater, they were impressively lifelike and clearly represented book hunters, whose martial accoutrements had been reproduced with great skill and accuracy. They proceeded to duel with axes and fire arrows at each other until all sank lifeless to the ground. Despite the bloodthirsty nature of the performance, it had been staged with loving care and considerable artistry. Then the copper curtain fell, and to my great disappointment, the little theater show was over. It was an amazing invention, an intelligent toy for adults. For the first time, in spite of my perilous predicament, I felt the desire to own a book from the catacombs. I had only to take it with me after all. As things now stood, I would be bound to find an exit soon, and a rare item like this would surely be worth a fortune up in Bookholm. But wait, something was moving in the lower part of the mechanical book. A dozen tiny windows had appeared, a whole row of them, with letters of the Zamonian alphabet rotating inside them, like the cylinders in a one-armed bandit. Then, with a click, 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 the letters came to a halt, and when read in succession, formed a sentence. It ran, "Golden Beard the Hair Splitter wishes you a good trip." Eh? I said foolishly, as if the book had spoken to me. In reply, I heard a musical box in its mechanical innards strike up a tune. It was the traditional Zamonian funeral march we had played at Dancelot's cremation. I looked again. "Golden Beard the Hair Splitter wishes you a good trip." A disappointingly meaningless message after that brilliant puppet show. Or was it a riddle? One moment. Golden Beard the Hair Splitter. Wasn't that the book hunter claimed by Regenschein to have made a habit of eliminating his competitors with book traps of exceptional subtlety? Yes, Golden Beard was a former watchmaker who used his knowledge of precision engineering to... It was only then that I noticed a fine silver wire running from the spine of the book to the shelf. It had gone taut and was vibrating violently. I dropped the book in a hurry. It clattered to the floor, still playing the funeral march, but I was far too late. I heard more wires twanging, heard them go taut all along the passage like the strings of a gigantic harp being tuned, followed by a rumble like distant thunder. I glanced over my shoulder in dismay. At the upper end of the passage, the massive wooden bookcases were toppling over one by one. By disturbing this cunning book trap, I'd activated a hidden mechanism. The bookcases were felling each other in turn like dominoes. Hundreds and thousands of volumes cascaded onto the steeply inclined floor, and the bookcases came crashing down after them. Wood, paper, and leather piled up into a huge wave that bore swiftly down on me like an avalanche of mud, speeding up along a dried-up riverbed. I sprinted down the passage in the opposite direction, but I didn't get far. The avalanche overtook me and swept me along in a churning mass of books that battered my head and body and eventually robbed me of sight. I was tossed around, yelling at the top of my voice. Then, all at once, I was falling. As if in the grip of a waterfall, I plummeted into an abyss with the avalanche of books. All I could hear was the air rushing past. I finally came to rest with a sudden frightful jolt, and a hailstorm of books descended on my back. Thousands of them must have piled up on top of me. Total silence and utter darkness engulfed me. I couldn't move. I could scarcely breathe. I had been buried alive in books.